Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 9th and final Conversation with Science here at the New York Times Climate Hub. We're going to have a conversation between two biodiversity and sustainability scientists from the Natural History Museum who are going to have a conversation about their work and then open up to questions from the floor. So I'm delighted to welcome to the stage Andy Purvis and Adriana Palma from the Natural History Museum.
The video before we... Okay. Sorted. Thank you. So, yeah, I'm Andy Purvis. This is Adriana Palma. And the original idea, I think, of our conversation was that it would be probably quite heavily science-focused, but with all new thinking, as those slides were showing. It doesn't feel kind of quite right, because COP is not so much about taking your stuff and showing it to people. Really, we want to kind of discuss a little bit about what COP has done, to how we think. But I'd like to start, Adriana, by asking, why is the Natural History Museum here at COP? Because we haven't been previously.
No, and I'm hoping that we'll be a presence at future COPs as well, because really the Natural History Museum is all about connecting people with nature. And that's not, just by having people come to our amazing museum and sharing our, passion for nature and the diversity of life with them, but it's also about creating advocates for the planet, really getting people engaged with the problems that our world is facing, not just to protect the planet, but also to protect people. And at COP, it was really an opportunity for us to come here and show that the museum's doing a lot of, robust, rigorous science, trying to provide evidence to policymakers so that we can all make better decisions. So the work that we've been doing in the museum, in kind of our lab, is really about data science. So I don't know if many of you have come to some of the conversations with scientists before, but a lot of scientists in the museum have an incredible amount of expertise on a specific group of species, whereas what we do is a little bit broader than that. So we bring together data from around the world to try and understand how is biodiversity, the diversity of life, responding to human activities, decisions about how we manage the land around us. What impact is that having on the diversity of life? And by asking those kinds of questions, developing global indicators to show the status of biodiversity, we can also start to help planning, because we can predict under different policy situations what might happen to biodiversity in the next 10, 50, 100 years. So we can really help to plan like that. So as I say, our presence at COP is really about bringing that engagement and science together.
And that's definitely been a strand that we've worked as a team across from public engagement through to science, and we're now developing a policy unit as well at the Natural History Museum to try and provide, I guess, that a sort of authoritative voice, in that we're as you say, we're not a conservation organisation. It's about people and the planet, and trying to have a more kind of constructive interplay.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I suppose the next question then is why is it important to be talking about biodiversity at a climate conference?
Yeah, because there's so much focus on net zero and climate change as the biggest crisis facing humanity, and it sort of may be, but biodiversity loss, climate change isn't even in the top 3 drivers of biodiversity loss yet. So biodiversity loss is a somewhat separate crisis, but there's a lot of overlap. There are overlapping problems with overlapping solutions. In that, nature-based solutions that do help environmental challenges, but also help biodiversity to recover from the damage we've done, have enormous potential to help us get to and get us beyond net zero. And so I guess really what we're trying to do is point out, as well as net zero, nature positive needs to be an objective, because of the maybe 8 million animal and plant species that we share the planet with, 1 million are threatened with extinction, but also billions of people are critically dependent on the biodiversity in the local ecosystems where they live. And you don't need to lose any species from the planet for them to lose their livelihoods and their livings. So we're, as well as reporting on the sort of climate science and trying to ensure that good things happen there, pointing out that the ways that we tackle it mustn't make the biodiversity crisis worse. And so, for instance, when you have countries with net zero plans that involve massive expansion of biofuels in biodiversity hotspots, that's really alarming, to us, and so we're kind of advocating for that. And also, this COP is part of one ongoing strand from the UN, and there's also the Biodiversity COP coming up in Kunming, hopefully next spring, summer, where the focus there is more on the biodiversity side, and they're both long, ongoing strands. And of course, you, unlike me, you've been to a biodiversity COP, and also, unlike me, you've been to a World Economic Forum at Davos, and so there are these sort of 3 fora where lots of stakeholders, movers and shakers get together. How do they kind of compare and contrast, and are some better than others, or do you? What's the difference?
I mean, I don't think that any are better than others, but they've had a very different focus, I think. So here, although the Natural History Museum is at COP talking about biodiversity, there is still that separation between biodiversity and climate, as though they are completely separate crises, rather than really interlinked. Not just as you were saying, that they have similar solutions, similar problems, and biodiversity can be important for mitigating against climate change, but also biodiversity offers us some solutions we haven't found yet, drought-resistant crops and things like that. We're at danger of losing some of those avenues if we lose biodiversity. So here, I think that separation has been more evident than I would have liked. Whereas I think at the World Economic Forum, sustainability as a whole was really the conversation. So it wasn't just about climate mitigation, and it wasn't just about biodiversity loss. It was also about human well-being and how all of these different aspects interact with one another, and how we can use, economy to drive change. But they are different players, really, that are at these conferences. So whereas at World Economic Forum, of course, governments did take an interest, but really my impression was that the biggest changes were going to be coming from companies, because that's where, they were really recognizing the long-term financial implications of not dealing with climate change, of not dealing with biodiversity loss. Because if you've got a company that, produces a specific food product, how are you going to produce that in 50 years when the areas you're growing in are no longer suitable? The pollinators that you rely on for those crops are no longer available. Whereas at the Biodiversity Conference of the Parties and here, I think there is a more diverse range of voices calling for change. I hope that will be successful. I think we've both had kind of good and bad, I don't want to say bad, take-homes from COP. So for you, what's been the best and the worst aspects of this experience?
So this is where we play good cop, bad cop. Yeah. So, sorry. So for me, the really good thing has been seeing the diversity and the range of the growing community of organizations and people and voices who are really wanting rapid progress, who are acting in the best possible faith, sometimes involving compromise that can put them in a messy spot, but they really are deeply committed, and that's ranging through from indigenous peoples here who've been, really very strong voices, some of the strongest voices here, the protesters and the activist groups, but also, the global GFAMs, getting global financial organizations to commit to hopefully a ratcheting process where the commitments will get stronger. And so with it being such a broad coalition, there is now the feeling that the forces of darkness are becoming encircled and assailed from all sides, as I think they have to be. And so there's a real feeling that we're maybe close to that kind of tipping point where those actors are called out repeatedly and just every day, and the reputational damage they suffer makes them change their ways. But then, in among that, on the bad cop side, we've got countries who are viewing COP26 as an opportunity to sell fossil fuels to other countries. I mean, it's just astonishing to me. It's like having a peace conference where the stalls are selling Kalashnikovs and landmines. How? For me, bewildering.
Yeah.
How about you?
I mean, again, I think it comes to this separation between solutions, because while, we have had some positive messages regarding commitments, we often don't have any access to their plan of how they're going to achieve these commitments. Yeah. And where we have had a little bit more information, that's sometimes been extremely upsetting. So for instance, with Indonesia trying to reduce, trying to basically carbon offset by planting more oil palm. Yes, planting oil palm will sequester carbon, and so that can have some, impact on the climate change situation, but you're losing your natural biodiversity. That is not good for the planet when you're expanding these very harmful crops, and it's not going to be good for the people either. Yeah. So it's looking at this planetary solution through such a minuscule lens, and it can lead to some questionable decisions, I think. Yeah. But on the good side, just the conversations that we've been having with just so many different kinds of people, and you know, some of the incredible youth activists. I mean, I've been, you know, really privileged to have conversations with many, you know, especially young active women, just absolutely incredible. And speaking with them is really making me actually reconsider the way that I do science, I think.
So, it's definitely true. Adriana, I hope you don't mind me highlighting that you, as you put it, you were fangirling on meeting a group of the activists. So
really
upstairs in the
was.
nature bar, Choked Up did a session and were astonishing, and Force of Nature, amazing, just to name two of the groups. But you say that it's actually affecting what now you want the thrust of the research to be. So,
absolutely.
So could you just expand on that a bit?
Yeah, you know, one of the big messages that I think has come out quite clearly from COP is that we really need diverse voices at the decision makers' tables. And I absolutely agree with that. But the decision makers' table, you know, for me, that's really far into the process. You know, that's not where this starts. So at the museum, when we're doing science and we're deciding what to research, we're trying to figure out, okay, what evidence do our policymakers and companies and people need to make sustainable choices? But how are we coming up with those research questions? You know, if we're not engaging with all of these voices at the very beginning of this process, not just at the end when we try and, you know, communicate our results to them, you know, we should be bringing them in right from the start to try and figure out, you know, what questions are important to different sectors of society. And so what evidence should we be gathering and how should we be gathering it to really have the biggest impact? And so, you know, that's leading to real shifts, I think, in the way that we're doing our research. So when we came to COP, you know, we just produced a new set of biodiversity indicators, and it's, you know, available on the Natural Museum's Biodiversity Trends Explorer. And that's really about showing countries, you know, what's the state of your biodiversity? How did you get to where you are, and how might you be going, where might you be going in the future? And, you know, that's been really powerful, but talking with these youth activists, you know, now we're thinking about, it's not just what's the status of your biodiversity. We should also be thinking about how accessible is that high biodiversity area? Who is it accessible by? So instead of, you know, simply creating indicators of biodiversity, you know, what if we shift our perspective and use that to now look at environmental justice?
Yeah.
You know, and that's something that we can collaborate with other people to produce, and we've not really done that before. And, you know, the other thing I think is that when we're producing these, you know, indicators of what might happen in the future on the Biodiversity Trends Explorer, they're looking at very broad policy decisions because they're aimed at policymakers. But, you know, a specific individual, you know, what can they do? How does, you know, changing your food consumption practices, you know, shifting your diets, reducing your food waste, eating more locally, how do those actions potentially impact biodiversity in the next, you know, 50, 100 years?
Yeah. So one thing, I completely agree with you that bringing the voices in at the design stage in for those discussions is really important. Something I'd just like to add is kind of a plea to higher education and science funding in the UK, but also globally, which is that social mobility into science is going down. Science is increasingly an expensive pursuit to get into, and it can be really, really difficult for people without some financial backing and the security and the knowledge that there's someone who'll catch them if it, you know, doesn't pan out. It's really challenging for people in ways that it shouldn't be, because, you know, the slides again at the beginning showed this is a huge challenge. So we need the thinking from all of the brains, not just the thinking from the brains from the, you know, great, fantastic middle class who can afford science as a as a career. So it would be lovely to see more support coming in so that these voices are not only talking to the scientists at the design stage, but are the scientists at the design stage. And I think that if funding in science globally had been different, what we know about biodiversity would be really, really, really different. But, sorry, rant over for now. What I'd like to ask, though, you mentioned that's what you'll do, that's what we'll do. A question we're often asked, what can individuals do? Given the magnitude of the problem, can individuals make a difference? What can they do? Because not all individuals are in a situation where, for a range of perfectly good reasons, they can't really be kind of high-profile activists necessarily. So how can they be sure they're helping?
I mean, there are obviously a number of ways, but if I have to pick one that I really think could have an incredibly huge difference to both the climate problems and also biodiversity, I have to say I think I'd choose food waste. Just reducing the amount of food you waste is really such a small action to take. But when we've got a third of the food we produce globally being wasted, at the same time as we've got many people suffering from famine and malnourishment, I mean, that is, that's not just a planetary tragedy, that's a real human tragedy as well. And agriculture is one of the biggest drivers of both biodiversity loss and climate change. So simply by wasting less food, you'll save money, you'll reduce the pressures on the planet to help save biodiversity and climate change, and potentially there'll be more food to help distribute more equitably. So really it's just a win across the board, and I say it's such a small action to take that many people can do. But that really does put the onus on individuals, though, and I think we've got to be a little bit careful here, because while we do all have a part to play, the responsibility doesn't just lie at the individual level. We really need much more action from governments and companies. So I'll flip the question back to you and say, for those sectors, where do you think the change needs to come?
As the middle-aged white male on the panel, the question about governments and companies rightly comes to me. So I agree with you completely that it's all too easy for governments and companies to put the onus on individuals, saying individual responsibility, individual freedoms should dictate choices. But actually, individuals and companies operate within the framework of legislation and regulation that government and only governments can, it's kind of what governments are for. So I think there's a real difficulty that at the moment, the markets within which companies operate and within which individuals make their decisions are not working because they're only considering economic, so financial and material capital. They're not considering human, social, and natural capital. And those things are in tension. So as an example of a tension that in this system that's not to do with biodiversity, so GDP is how how governments report growth. It does not consider rearing your children because that isn't traded. But obviously, you can improve GDP by stopping anyone rearing their children. That's not a society we want to live in. At the moment, companies are trying to make a profit, maximize their profit, but the framework within which they're doing it allows them to degrade the environment. Now, if instead anyone who's degrading the environment has to pay the full environmental cost of doing so, then all of the innovation, all of the genius of the market that free marketeers talk about would find straight away less resource-intensive ways of turning ecosystem processes into commodities that do much less damage, But at the moment, that's not the system. We shouldn't be relying on companies to be altruistic. We shouldn't be relying on them in that way. Now, I say that I've got no beef with governments, with companies trying to make a profit. I do when they start lobbying, when they start trying to delay the actions and changes that are needed. And I would really hope that governments will stop listening to lobbyists who have been lying to them for decades and who've been shown now to be lying to them for decades. Some kind of 3 strikes and you're out. If you act in bad faith, you lose the ear of governments. And then I think that could be a really big change. I'd love to see that. My feeling, so we've got another sort of 7 minutes or so to go. So we can't actually see you, but we'd love for this conversation to continue and bring others in. I see a hand there. Could a microphone get to you?
Yep,
Yes.
I think that's happening.
I think so. Brilliant.
Yeah, hi, how are you? I'm an assistant professor at the University of North America, but I'm an Indigenous person first. And my question kind of has 2 parts, is that we know that Indigenous people are responsible for the protection of an overwhelming amount of biodiversity on the planet, upwards of 80%. So how do you reconcile this, the beliefs that we need to find something new in technological advancement, while also listening and trying to hear what Indigenous people are saying, that we have the traditional ecological knowledges that serve this planet, our ecosystems best?
Yeah.
And 2, at the same time, how do you have a reparative strategy to be able to, I guess, ground ourselves in these relationships from white, like settler colonial institutions like museums and universities, and have that kind of reparations framework around, like, for one, like repatriation of the artifacts that still belong to our tribes and peoples, to start investing in our communities and repairing those relationships?
Great questions. Do you want to take first or second half? Which one?
Probably the first half, so
Okay.
about... So I fundamentally dislike the idea of us treating Indigenous lands as separate from us. Like, they are totally, those are our patches of high biodiversity areas, and they're managed really well, and we'll just protect around them, and then we'll trash everything outside. That is just, it just boggles the mind that is the approach we take, rather than going into, speaking with people and learning about processes of really working with nature and kind of balancing human and nature's needs so that everyone wins, and then, taking that knowledge outside. That's where I would like to see things going, rather than, because it is incredible the amount of biodiversity that is being conserved by Indigenous peoples in Indigenous lands. And, absolutely we have to protect that, but it can't be an isolated thing. We can't see that as a separate part of the world, and then it's okay to do what we want outside of those lands. So there needs to be much more integration and kind of knowledge exchange there.
So in terms of, I completely agree with that, and in the IP-Best Global Assessment we were able to show that Indigenous lands have retained a higher degree of the biodiversity they started out with, and the decline there, although it is a decline overall, is much less steep than outside Indigenous lands. Mm-hmm. So we need to be listening to Indigenous peoples rather than telling them things. Where the reparations side comes in, the geopolitics of it, I don't know. But if we start valuing natural, human, and social capital properly, one of the effects of that will be that a lot of regions of the world that are financially poor will turn out not to be poor because of the wealth of natural, human, and social capital that they have. And once that happens, the trade imbalances can flip round. And so if you've got a country that is a developed country, a post-industrial, post-agricultural economy that has very little of its original nature left, and it's trying to buy commodities, it's going to have to pay the full price. And if there's any disagreement, it's going to be the weaker negotiating partner. So that's not to say that reparations isn't a huge issue. I think it really, really is. But also, I do think that if we're able to get onto a sustainability track, then the places and the peoples that have managed to retain their nature, hold on to their natural capital, will find themselves in a much stronger position in situations like this than they have hitherto. Got time for another question, I think, if we, yeah.
Yeah, a question about sort of fossil fuel money in science and backing science. I know your museum's not necessarily part of it, but the British Museum had a climate change exhibit sponsored by BP. So I was saying your museum is not necessarily involved, but with climate finance and fossil fuel companies, how do we sort of balance the science where you have sponsors and taking money, then you can't go and say negative things. So how do sort of, you know, the New York Times themselves takes fossil fuel money, and I see ExxonMobil ads. So how do they balance being honest and truthful without just running every day? We need to stop burning fossil fuels because it's part of their, it goes against the economic model of the newspaper.
So, yeah.
Science.
So I saw a tweet from Exxon today saying, experts agree carbon capture and storage needs to be scaled up. We have the technology, read more here. And so I quote tweeted it, experts agree we need to stop burning fossil fuel. But a difficulty. So our museum doesn't concede editorial control, as I understand it. I'm certainly not aware of it ever doing so, whenever it's dealing with any kind of company. But we are in a difficult situation of funding. You know, a huge problem is that if you've got big pockets, you can get a big megaphone. And that's all manner of institutions, not just museums. It's that lobbying point. You know, if you have billionaire media outlets who are on your side, you have a megaphone. And when 50,000, however many people it was, take to the streets in one of the most uplifting, so we were caught up in it, not part of it, but moving between events through it. And it was just fantastically uplifting, friendly, generous-spirited, progressive, concerned. That isn't the radicalism. That is trying to retain a livable planet for future generations. I can't imagine anything more conservative with a small c than that. You know, that's just after long-term security. What's radical is continuing to sell fossil fuels come hell or high water, because we will get both hell and high water if we keep doing it.
Yeah.
So I completely agree.
Well, why does the New York Times turn down their money or ban their ads?
You would have to ask them. It's not that I don't think fossil fuel companies should be able to speak, but it's very important, I think, that they get called out when they're saying things that are prejudiced, that there are opposing views, that there actually is balance. And also that if a company is acting in bad faith and really is a climate inactivist, because they're the dangerous ones, right? If that's what they're doing, then they should lose their place at the table. They should lose their voice. They shouldn't be able to get finance because they're acting in bad faith.
So if BP continues to explore for oil instead of shutting down exploration, they keep bidding and expanding look at their balance sheets. They sponsored the British Museum, like a climate change exhibit. How does that comport?
You'd have to ask them. We're not anything to do with the British Museum.
As a museum, how do you feel about sponsorships of fossil fuel companies?
What I would prefer, personally, and this is very much a personal opinion, I would prefer that all the organisations that make loads and loads of money have to pay loads and loads of tax, so that organisations that are supposed to be independent and publicly funded can be independent and publicly funded.
So, yes, we're out of time. So we are out of time, so apologies.
Sorry,
but,
I did say I might rant again.
Yes, but we don't want the conversation to end here. So please, do come up after the session, or contact us at the Natural History Museum, and we'd love to have conversations, because that's been the best part of COP, really, speaking with people from different places, different parts of life. It'd be great to continue that. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Yes.